In this roundup of the week's news, on the day that sees the largest climate strike event so far worldwide, a new poll suggests a majority of people now support government controls on flying. Or does it? For some inexplicable reason, it turns out that if you tell children they're going to die from climate change, this turns into mental health problems. And California's blocked from setting its own auto-emission standards as young people give evidence to Congress on climate change. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Just a reminder in case you didn't see last week's Friday video. These Friday videos are now a roundup of interesting news from the week to sit alongside the themed videos that are released on the Monday or the Tuesday. So let's jump straight in with this week. And I start with some news that came out a couple of days ago that I found rather startling. And it was this, that 2/3 of Britons support limiting air travel to address climate change. It goes on. More than 60% of Britons believe tackling the climate crisis requires high or extremely high levels of urgency, according to the results of a new YouGov poll, which suggests growing public support for limiting air travel and meat consumption. 2/3 of respondents, 67%, also said limits should be placed on air travel in order to curb emissions, with just 22% against such a move. And 53% were of the view that the UK also needed to reduce its meat intake in order to cut emissions versus 37% against. And there were a bunch of similar headlines. Obviously, the campaigners were all over this, with one tweeting, "There's growing public support for limiting air travel and meat consumption to tackle the #climate emergency. 67% say limits should be placed on air travel. It's government that needs to make it happen." Now, if that's true, that is a major shift in public opinion, of the most extraordinary kind, frankly. So, what do we do when faced with extraordinary claims? Obviously, we look at the source material. The poll was commissioned by the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, CAST, and the research was part of their launch. So I went to their website and downloaded the full report, and it turns out, astonishingly, that all was not entirely as reported. There were a bunch of stats about how a majority of people in the UK now think about climate change as a serious problem, not particularly surprising or news in itself. But what about the new appetite for top-down government controls on flying and eating meat? Well, it turns out the questionnaire they used didn't ask anything of the sort. The question people were actually asked went like this. Thinking about the potential ways to tackle climate change, to what extent do you think we should do the following? A. Reduce the amount of meat in our diets. B. Limit the amount of flying that we do. Now, does that sound to you like a question about top-down government controls? Because it doesn't to me. It sounds to me like it's asking, which of these things do you think we should personally do in our own lives? Indeed, that you should personally do in your own life. There's nothing here about should the government impose controls on whether you can fly or not, or should the government restrict the amount of beef that you're allowed to eat. It clearly wasn't intended in the survey. And the write-up of that survey is just the latest example of how these sorts of figures get distorted and misrepresented by people who are promoting the agenda that government should dictate how people should live their lives. Now look, even if you think government should do exactly that, you should still expect that reports about what the public thinks should be represented honestly. It's worth mentioning that the commissioning organisation, CAST, didn't feed the incorrect story. The direct quote they gave for the launch of their poll was much more in line with the actual data. Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, said, "Our new survey findings make clear that most people feel climate change is an urgent issue and are willing to make significant changes to their own lifestyles to help tackle it." She said changing travel and food habits were amongst the most significant things individuals could do to reduce their carbon footprint, and added, "It's very encouraging that there's support amongst the public for making these changes." And you'd expect their focus to be on the individual choices people make, because that's the whole purpose of CAST. which exists to, quote, explore ways people can act directly to cut their own carbon emissions and influence other people and policies, focusing on food, diet, transport and mobility, consumption of goods and heating and cooling. Now, personally, I think they're being overly optimistic to suggest the poll gives real evidence that people are ready to make changes. Marketing directors know that what people say in focus groups and in answers to questionnaires often reflects what they think they should say rather than what they will actually go on to do. This is a classic area where this sort of phenomenon will be expected to kick in. And to be honest, I'm not a fan of putting the focus on the things that ordinary people should be guilted into giving up. It frames the whole agenda in the wrong way if you're actually interested in building public support for practical action. Much better in the earlier stages to get people to focus on things they can positively do that will benefit them, like developing systems to waste less food and thereby save money. Most people feel bad about wasting food, but don't really know how to avoid it. And they benefit by wasting less. So there's lots to be done there. And start getting people ready for the age of electric road transport. People fly seldom but drive often. Sell to them the long-term benefits of being early into electric cars. But really, mostly focus on holding the government to account for its commitments to transforming the energy grid to get to net zero carbon, because that's where the heavy lifting really needs to be done. Now, incidentally, before we move on, that survey went on to ask respondents what factors had recently led them to become more concerned about climate change. The largest group, at 27%, said because of observable extreme weather events. The smallest group, at just 1.5%, said they'd been influenced by protest campaigns by groups such as Extinction Rebellion. Now, I'm willing to bet that's one statistic they won't be tweeting out anytime soon, and nor will Rupert Read be sharing it on the Today programme. It slightly reinforces what I've said all along about protests that use illegal actions in the way Extinction Rebellion does. It's polarising. That means people already on your side will mostly love it, but you will fail to persuade the people on the other side. But since public concern is being heightened because we're seeing actual consequences of climate change before our eyes, the groups will, of course, point to that and try to take the credit. Now, speaking of Extinction Rebellion, let's talk about young people. This week we saw some exceptional young people giving a pretty good account of themselves, giving testimonies for US Congress. But before we talk about them, we need to go back to Extinction Rebellion's approach to this topic. In previous videos, I've criticised Extinction Rebellion for telling children they will die young of climate change. I've specifically gone through Rupert Read's presentation to young people, telling them why they're going to die young and showing why at least some of the science he puts forward is wrong. And I've pointed out that his argument that Extinction Rebellion should aim to get children arrested in their forthcoming October actions. I've expressed my opinion that this is disgusting and reprehensible when adults put children in this sort of position. Well, this week there was a piece in the Daily Telegraph noting that rising numbers of children are being treated for what's described as eco-anxiety. Experts have said that some parents are terrifying their youngsters with talk about climate catastrophe. Extinction Rebellion and its associated apocalyptic messaging have, according to this article, have prompted a tsunami of young people seeking help. A group of psychologists working with the University of Bath says it's receiving a growing volume of inquiries from teachers, doctors and therapists unable to cope. The Climate Psychology Alliance, CPA, told the paper that children complaining of eco-anxiety have even been given psychiatric drugs. According to Caroline Hickman, teaching fellow at Bath and a CPA executive, parents need to find some words to talk about it that is age appropriate and not terrifying. You need to separate what's fact from what is unknown. Tell them some species are going extinct and some humans are being harmed, but don't say we're all going to die because that isn't true. And of course, this is absolutely right. Shall we just remind ourselves about how Rupert Read introduces his talk aimed at the children? Let's do that quickly.
You are in a terrible predicament. It's worse than you've been told, almost certainly. Probably a lot worse. Dangerous climate change and the extinction crisis, the crisis of many, many species going extinct as we speak, if they're not stopped, will mean that you do not have normal lives like your parents have. This is about whether you have a future. People probably sometimes ask you, What are you going to be when you grow up? But we've reached a point in human history where the question also has to be asked, what are you going to do if you grow up?
Now, in the light of that story, does that feel age appropriate to you? Do you think there might be anything, just a teensy-weensy little element in that approach that might feed depression and hopelessness born of eco-anxiety? All the responsible adults who are watching this video who are involved with Extinction Rebellion, I know you hate it when I criticise the group, and I understand that, but can you just for a moment step back and reflect what impact all of this is having on the children the group claims to be campaigning on behalf of? I mean, seriously. I do understand that it's easy to miss some of this stuff because some of the young people that have been put in the spotlight have actually been doing a pretty remarkable job. It's easy to see that and think, well, that's the normal response. And when it comes to Greta Thunberg, I am one of those people who has mixed feelings. There's no doubt that her role in the movement has become immense. And for some people, no comment or criticism is possible, while some others have just come to loathe her and the idea that adults should be encouraging children to play this sort of role. Personally, I've been concerned that she's been put into an unenviable position, and I'm reminded of some of the mental health problems that other young people have had when they've been put into symbolic leadership roles for campaigns. That said, so far she seemed a lot more solidly rooted than any young person should be expected to be, given all the Twitter hate that comes with that sort of high profile. And I think that probably comes of feeling that she's making a real difference, which she does seem to be, because it tends to be the feeling of helplessness that feeds anxiety and despair. But when you tell your children, or indeed Rupert, other people's children, that they're going to die young, that doesn't make them feel strong and empowered. Like Greta, it makes them feel despair. But let's also give credit where it's due, and even though I agree with some of the critics that young people lack the maturity and so are limited in what they can offer in terms of contribution to solving complex problems, nevertheless, Greta and her other young colleagues did a pretty outstanding job of giving testimony to the US Congress. I liked the fact that she chose not to give formal input, but handed them the IPCC report and said, I don't want you to listen to me, I want you to listen to the scientists. Absolutely answers that criticism about the role of children. She was effectively saying, we're not here as experts, we're here as stakeholders. And I love the fact that when one of the congressmen came up with the usual line about why should we do this if China isn't doing it, she said this.
Another perspective, I am from Sweden, it's a small country. And there it is the same argument. Why should we do anything? Just look at the US, they say. So just so you know, that is being used against you as well.
I mean, that's a pretty spectacular burn right there. Offered in exactly the right, respectful tone of voice. Whatever you think of the phenomenon of Greta, I think you have to say she has handled her trip to the US pretty well so far. And I was equally impressed, and maybe even more so, with one of the other young people there, Benji Backer, a young man rather than a child. They're representing the movement of conservatives who are serious about climate change. Those of you who have watched my videos before will know that I place quite a high store on building back the consensus for action on climate change on the political right. Because a system where one party argues for climate action and the other argues against it can never be sustainable, unless you end up with a one-party state, which is a really bad idea for all sorts of reasons, not least because the left isn't doing that great a job of coming up with a workable policy on climate change, for all that they're making radical noises. And in the age of Trump, I thought it was particularly important to have this voice represented. Here's some of what Benji Backer had to say.
To my fellow conservatives, the climate is changing. It's time to claim our seat at the table and develop smart, limited government policies to establish American leadership on this issue. There is a reasonable, conservative approach to climate change, and we need to embrace it. To those on the left, without your leadership, this would not be receiving the attention that it deserves. But now, it's time for solutions. Politicizing climate change has deepened the partisan divide and delayed real action. If you truly want to address climate change, work with conservatives who want to champion reforms. To Congress, on climate change, it's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about those who are taking effective action and those who are not.
This was all a show, of course. I mean, real progress in the US Congress probably doesn't come from these sorts of occasions. But it's important that they happen because you just never know which moments spark something more. And nothing underlined the contrast between what he said and what he's done, more than the fact that at the same time this testimony was going on, President Trump was revoking the right of the state of California to set its own more stringent vehicle emission standards, with the de facto impact of reducing standards for American cars nationwide. Now, a quick bit of background on this. California was first allowed to introduce its new standards in the 1970s, when the state was suffering huge problems with air pollution and smog. The state was able to set its own standards so long as it was able to show why they were needed. The thing is, of course, that California represents around 12% of all cars bought and sold in the US, so higher standards there basically became higher standards nationwide, because manufacturers aren't going to make two types of vehicles, one for California and one for the rest. In July this year, California negotiated with the manufacturers and got them to agree to meet a standard of 50 miles per gallon by 2026, as opposed to the 37 miles per gallon that exists currently. If you saw my video on Bjorn Lomborg earlier this week, you'll have heard already a reference to the fact that fuel efficiency standards for cars in America are well behind those in Europe. Trump's tweet announcing the move claimed it would boost jobs, although it seems just as likely it's a move provoked by California's positioning of itself as the protagonist-in-chief against the Trump administration, and the association of the latest version of the deal with the Obama administration. And look, it's an unhelpful step. I don't think the US car industry does itself any favours by going for lower standards. To be honest, that's pretty much how Toyota managed to become for a while the number one motor company in the United States. While the traditional Detroit firms were lobbying Congress for lower fuel efficiency standards, the Japanese firms were investing in the cleaner technology to meet the inevitably higher standards of tomorrow. It's worth noting that although that's for history, not all of the motor companies are big fans of Trump's action here. Some are reported to be worrying that without significant increases in fuel efficiency, US vehicles will be less competitive globally, which will actually lead to job losses, not gains. But does it really matter? Because it's probably more important now how fast the influence of Tesla and the various catch-up products of its competitors can begin to really shape the future of the industry for electric vehicles. That's assuming, of course, that Tesla survives, which you can never take for granted. The other question, though, is actually this. Where should policy on fuel emission standards be set? Surely it probably should actually be nationally. Of course, campaigners don't generally care about good process or worry about what precedents get set. Whatever process will deliver the end result that they want is a good process as far as they're concerned. At least until the shoe is on the other foot and the precedent they supported gets used against them. And whatever level of government that is controlled by the other side is the level that should be disempowered on all important issues. So in the US, the left think that California should be able to set the standards because otherwise, well, it's Trump. And in the UK, the left thinks that the European Union should set the environmental standards because otherwise, well, it's for Tories. But whether it's actually a good idea that an individual state gets to wag the national dog or an unelected bureaucracy gets to dictate to the nation state, these are questions that should probably be considered according to the principle, not down to whether the individual incumbent has your support or not. And that could go either way, because there are arguments both ways. According to the BBC, 67% of Americans say they support state governments setting stricter fuel efficiency standards than the federal government. I wasn't able to locate the original survey for that to verify the methodology, by the way. Now, in this case, of course, California will appeal the measure, and we'll see how far that particular conflict flies. Now, last week I finished on a lighter note for something I liked, but this week let's turn instead to something I don't. The website Snopes is something I've used often over the years, as you can imagine, because I'm forever checking whether stories being spread by one side or the other are actually based on fact. Sites like Snopes have been an important tool. However, it came to attention this week that the site is apparently getting increasingly woke, and this may be starting to activate a reality distortion field. It came in the answer to this question: did Colonel Sanders steal the KFC original recipe from a black woman named Miss Childress? This came from an item that was circling the internet with this photo and the text, "Meet Miss Childress. Colonel Sanders stole his famous fried chicken recipe from a black woman named Mrs. Childress. He later paid her $1,200 for the recipe. KFC is worth $15 billion today." Another version says that Mrs. Childress died in poverty. So how did Snopes rate this story? It says it lacks concrete evidence, but alludes to a deeper truth. Hold on, I mean, what? Alludes to a deeper truth. What is that right there? Is a story true or not? That's the question. And of course the answer is that it isn't true. If you think that's a rather nice picture for an unknown woman who died in poverty, you would be right. Snopes identifies that the image is taken from a 1920 magazine advertisement for snowdrift shortening. The tin of snowdrift is in the foreground of the picture, but of course that's blurred out in the circulated meme. It then points out that there's no evidence of the claim either. One of the versions of the story said that the claim was made in Ron Douglas's book, America's Most Wanted Recipes, but it wasn't. It's not in there. And it doesn't seem likely when you look at the detail of how Sanders first started. So it's false then. You may say the story is unproven, but the fact the picture used is from an advert clearly shows that it's false. But no, says Snopes, the point is it reveals a deeper truth. The truth lies in the following paradox. Anyone who knew anything of the South knew that no Kentucky colonel would have cooked the fried chicken in a Southern household. The chicken in prosperous Southern households, particularly in the Colonel's era, was inevitably cooked by a black maid or family housekeeper. Colonel Sanders created an alternative reality in which the white planter not only ate the chicken, but implicitly made it. Well, it's kind of an interesting argument about the nature of KFC's early branding. I think you could probably argue it both ways. But what's it got to do with this story being true or not? It's a simple question of fact. The Snopes piece goes on to quote someone else, confirming that there was no evidence that the story was true, but there were other white chefs taking recipes from African American women and men without giving them credit. I mean, what? Is this what fact-checking has become? There is no evidence that Mr. Mallen Baker committed this burglary, but other men of his age and also possessing 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth have also been known to commit burglaries, so we can't rule it out. I mean, this photo of him committing a burglary, admittedly, that's not actually him in the photo, but maybe it's just indicative of a deeper truth. When people suggest that we're in the politically inspired post-truth era, this is kind of what we mean. And of course everyone thinks only the other side does it, or at least it's only bad when the other side does it. There is no cause that becomes more noble or right through the act of telling demonstrable untruths in its promotion. Snopes rates this story as unproven but with a deeper truth. Clearly the story is false. We should be able to say that without making political speeches about the fact that other people did some bad things at the same time. That's it for this week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.